Information Technology Governance, Part 2. Once upon a time, an aerospace company in Maryland and a Japanese automobile company decided to have a competitive boat race on the Potomac River. Both teams practiced really hard and long to reach their peak performance. On the big day, they both felt ready as they could be. The Japanese won by a mile. Afterwards, the American team became very discouraged by the loss and morale sagged. Corporate management decided that the reason for the crushing defeat had to be found. A continuous, measurable improvement team was set up to investigate the problem and to recommend appropriate corrective action. Here's their conclusion. The problem was that the Japanese team had 8 people rowing and 1 person steering, whereby the American team had 1 person rowing and 8 people steering. The American Company Steering Committee immediately hired a consulting firm to do a study on the management structure. After some time and millions of dollars, the consulting firm concluded that too many people were steering and not enough rowing. To prevent losing to the Japanese again the next year, the team's management structure was totally reorganized to 4 steering managers, 3 area steering managers, 1 staff steering manager, and a new performance system for the person rowing the boat to give him more incentive to work harder. Quote, "We must give him empowerment and enrichment. That should accomplish our total quality management goals." Needless to say, the next year, the Japanese won by 2 miles. Humiliated, the aerospace company then laid off the rower for poor performance, sold the paddles, canceled all capital investment for new equipment, halted development of a new boat, gave a high-performance award to the consulting firm, then distributed the money saved as bonuses to the senior executives. The end. In this CBT Nugget, Information Technology Governance Part 2, we're going to cover 5 key knowledge areas. We're going to look at information technology policies, information security IS policy documents, procedures, the risk management process as it relates to IT governance, and risk analysis methods. A policy is defined as a high-level document, and it's high-level in a couple of ways. Number one, it's high-level from the sense of that's the target of the policy document. Stakeholders, senior management, executive management. It's also high-level regarding its content. Okay, it's kind of an overall view from 2,000 feet portraying the organizational philosophy and strategy. It's a concise and lucid document that represents the general goals, general directives, objectives, and the vision of the business or the organization. Now, if it's a small to medium-sized business, you may just stop there. You have your policy document. But then, in a larger organization, you may have what are called lower-level policies. And these lower-level policies are aimed at individual divisions of the organization, departments of your company, business units, etc., with a top-down approach. These lower-level policies are derived from the higher-level documents. As part of the policy generation process, I'm going to give you a tool here for creating, managing, and testing policies and procedures, but your management, and this can be a designated team of people, must reassess these policies on a regular basis, quarterly, biannually, annually, for updating the policies depending upon new mandates, new business needs, new products, new technologies, new government regulations, and so forth. Now, although there's a lot of different policies, high level and low level, what we're going to focus on here in this particular Nugget series as a CISA auditor is the information security policy. So let's look next at the information security policy document. The Information Security Policy Document, or the IS policy, is one that we're extremely concerned with. This document communicates the security standards to users, to management, and to any involved technical staff after it's been approved and published, either in a written format or possibly a web-based format or both. Now, your IS policy document is your first step in generating your IT security infrastructure and your overall security policy. It should contain quite a bit of information. This is stuff that you really need to memorize here. The IS policy document has to contain definitions, And these definitions may be at the beginning or the end of the document. And this is a kind of a glossary to define particular concepts and technologies for individuals who may not be IT or security savvy. The document should also state the objectives of the IS policy, also the scope. Does this relate to, let's say, the sales department? Is this an overall corporate policy? Maybe it's simply a sub-policy, a wireless infrastructure policy, security policy document. Maybe it relates to physical security. It also needs to include the management's state of intent. Why did they publish this policy document in the first place? It also needs to contain a framework for the risk assessment of the organization or the area that's being looked into. Also, risk management and what controls, what access controls and other controls are going to be selected and used to implement this policy and mitigate against challenges. It'll also contain a summary of the overall policies, principles, government compliance, and general standards that your organization or company are subject to. It may also have other references to support document, other published web-based documents, web pages, or PDF files that may be stored at your organization or somewhere out on the World Wide Web. Then, of course, the information security policy document should be reviewed regularly, again, quarterly, biannually, annually, and management must act upon these scheduled reviews. And of course, act upon means basically making modifications to the policy to adhere to, let's say, vulnerabilities and threats that have been realized, compensating for changes in the business structure or organizational structure, compensating for new technologies and new applications and services, or possibly bringing in third-party consultants to help meet some strategic needs of the overall information security initiative. Let's go on a little field trip up to the World Wide Web, and one of these places I want you to add to your favorites is this particular site right here. It's SANS.org, S-A-N-S, a huge organization for security. You can find out more about SANS by just clicking on one of these links. Why SANS, for example. But the site is sans.org/resources/policies. And this is an area where I want you to come and spend a little bit of time. Again, this is really more from a practical standpoint. This website helps you go and first of all differentiate between policies, standards, or guidelines. Then it has some very practical help here. It'll give you a primer on security policies, information security policies to be specific. Then you can get example policies or example templates. If we click on that link, you can see different types of policies that we can get templates for in PDF or Word document. Acceptable encryption policy, acceptable use policy, antivirus processes. Here's a good one, audit vulnerability scanning policy. This is one you definitely want to get, defining the requirements and provides the authority for the IS team to conduct audits and risk assessments to ensure integrity of information and resources. This would be one you definitely want to get that would apply to us as auditors. You can see dial-in access policies, DMZ lab, email restrictions, ethics, just a bunch of different policy documents. And these are good templates and good examples for you to get some real-world solutions. Let's go ahead and take a look at this sans.org audit vulnerability scan policy. And again, this is just a template, but it's for vulnerability scanning as part of the audit process, something that we would probably be doing as security auditors. Notice that it has a template. It has these little areas, these fields that you could fill in for the audit name, the company name, approved name or the software. And then you've got your first area is the purpose and the scope. And then here's the general policy information. And then of course it says this access may include, and it has several bullet points. Of course you can add to that. It's got areas under the policy, 3.1 network control, 3.2 service degradation or interruption, which relates to the network scanning or the audit policy, the scanning audit policy. It shows you the client point of contact during the scanning. Again, this relates to using software technologies, applications to do scanning of your organization and the policy that governs that audit scan, the period of time, and the enforcement that's based on the results of that scanning and the auditing. And then of course you have at the very bottom here a revision history. You should have a revision history at the end that relates to any revisions done to this policy policy. You may also have down here at the bottom a 6.0, and that could be your terminology, your definitions. That could be either at the end or the beginning. You'll see that sometimes in these small sub-policies, but more often than not, you'll see that in the general policy document. But this is just a good example of a template that relates to, for our purposes, audit vulnerability scanning and the policy that governs specifically that particular process. Then, of course, some incident handling forms. We'll talk more about incident handling later on in the CISA Nugget series, but these are just forms to handle different types of breaches, security vulnerabilities, and they use this kind of SCORE, S-C-O-R-E, which is kind of a cooperative between SANS and the Center for Internet Security, CIS. And just in case, I've mentioned HIPAA a couple of times throughout this Nugget series, just in case you aren't really familiar with what HIPAA does and the importance that it shows to the medical industry specifically, you can click on this little hypertext link here and say, what's all the hype on HIPAA? All right, so add this to your favorites. It's a very important site, one that you want to spend some time with, downloading some sample policies, sample templates, sample forms, sans.org. Now, it only makes sense that your information security policy should be reviewed on a regular basis. It should be done at planned intervals. If you have any major modifications to that policy, ongoing analysis of the appropriateness, of the adequacy, of the effectiveness of the policy. Every policy, for example, the one we looked at earlier, the audit scanning policy, that should have an owner. Okay, very important to know. Every policy should have an owner. It could be a CIO, it could be somebody that's a senior IT person who has approved responsibility from management for developing, reviewing, and evaluating that security policy. Always looking for ways to improve the organization's information security policy and operations. There's going to be management reviews that go on. There needs to be input to management. Okay, and then output from management. And again, you want to take into account the results of these management reviews. The input to a management review should be feedback from individual personnel. This could be done by surveys, questionnaires, observation, reviewing the results, an ongoing review result, and the results of previous management reviews. That should be also taken into consideration. Activity status reports, ongoing activity, progress reports as to compliance. Government compliance, so let's say HIPAA, for example, or Sarbanes-Oxley, compliance progress reports, change management log summaries, okay, summarizations of log entries to changes in configurations, to changes in applications, to changes in policy, change management log summaries, trend analysis to look forward to any changing trends that you can change your policies accordingly. And then, of course, incidents. And we looked earlier at sans.org, and there were some incident handling forms. Make sure you download those. Take a look at those forms. Those can be used as part of the review process, looking at the incident handling forms, making reports on those, and what types of responses and mitigation was taken based on the incidents. And of course, management recommendations, or recommendations from other personnel, even third-party auditors like yourselves. And then finally, you've got output from management, and this really gets down to improvement. Okay, what should the result of the management review be? It should be improvement. Improvement of your organization's approach to managing information security and the IS processes. Improvement of control objectives, okay, the way that we put in access control mechanisms and other types of controls to mitigate against risk and vulnerabilities, and improvement in the way we allocate resources, allocate physical resources, software resources, personnel resources, the time, the money, all of these things, and how do we allocate responsibilities. And again, you can make changes based on the results of these management reviews. Now, it's very common to hear the phrase policies and procedures, and these two go hand in hand, but realize that policies and procedures are not synonymous. What procedures are detailed documents that are derived from a parent policy. That's a very important concept to know. And these detailed documents place into action the actual specific intent of our policy statements. So for example, earlier when we saw the audit scanning policy, it didn't have step-by-step procedures for how to use the particular tool that we were using. It didn't even necessarily define the tool that we were going to use. Now, you could define the actual product like some type of net scanner, some type of penetration testing tool. If it's Wi-Fi, maybe you're using AeroPeak. Regardless, a procedure would have a step-by-step procedure for actually implementing and conducting the specific scanning and the audit of the scanning. So procedures are dynamic documents. They're going to change on a regular basis. They're going to reflect specific and regular shifts, okay? So they will change depending upon modifications to our business goals. If we decide to go use a tool, for example, that gives us greater penetration at a lower cost, well, then that'll make a modification to our business goal and to spending, our budget. Maybe our infrastructure. Maybe we're moving from a wired LAN environment to a Wi-Fi environment, a wireless LAN environment. So it's a dynamic document that's going to change depending upon our infrastructure and our business goals. Auditors are going to observe procedures, and that's a very important differentiation. Rarely is an auditor going to be the one that actually implements the procedures, okay? So the auditor will observe the procedures, will review the procedures to identify, evaluate, and test the controls and the processes. And if the auditor doesn't have the expertise to identify, evaluate, and test, it is the responsibility of that auditor to either learn or depend upon a qualified person to help them identify, evaluate, and test those controls or those procedures. Procedures should be fully disclosed to those people that they govern. So for example, if I'm putting people in charge of implementing a wireless security policy or implementing a vulnerability scanning policy and auditing that policy, I need to make sure that those individuals that are responsible for implementing that get all of the procedures, okay? Fully disclosed, fully trained, really. I would add to that trained. And this should be verified by some type of independent review, which that points to you, the auditor, and of course, are you going to make sure that the personnel is being properly disclosed and properly trained? That's part of the auditor's job. And then of course, this whole process of constructing, identifying, evaluating, and testing procedures can be accomplished through what's called the CMMI. This is a commonly used methodology for not just putting into place procedures, but also for software development, which really kind of goes hand in hand with putting in policies and procedures, but software development, application development, governance, things like that. Capability, maturity, model, integration. Let's take a look at that. The capability maturity model has been around since the early 1990s, I believe like 1991, and it was implemented by a consortium based on the Software Engineering Institute, which is a kind of a branch of Carnegie Mellon. And this is the document. You can go up and find this. If you just simply go to the World Wide Web and do a CMMI version 1.2, search for that, you will find this document in PDF format. And this applies to a lot of different processes, but we're specifically concerned with CMMI, this capability maturity model integration, for having a technique in place that will allow us to adhere to compliance with established policies and procedures. In other words, some type of model and methodology that allows us to go in and, as auditors, make sure that policies and procedures are implemented, managed, modified, tested and retested based on some type of established model. This CMMI is basically a three-part series. You can see the different disciplines here, how it applies to different types of things like application development, software development, and you can see a basic introduction. It shows the process area, the components of the process area here. If I expand that out and we scroll down, you've got diagrams that kind of explain this overall model for you. And then we go to look at part 2 here. And again, for your CISA exam, you don't have to really know any specifics about this CMMI. However, from a real world standpoint, just understanding policies and procedures and to be able to define them isn't enough. As an auditor, you need to have some type of established model, some type of established strategy and approach to all of the things that go with implementing and managing and testing a policy and a procedure. You can see here areas for measurement and analysis, decision analysis, integrating the project, process and product quality assurance, risk management. And again, this might be a little area to come in here and just kind of read through this risk management information. We're going to be looking at risk management in a little bit greater detail here. But you can see down here under CMMI, we've got areas that we've already talked about so far in this CISA series. Product teams, individuals who sponsor. That could be, of course, as we mentioned, somebody in executive management who's a sponsor for the particular project, particular implementation of a policy or procedure, and the steering group, steering committee. And again, this is something that we referred to earlier as well. So make sure you go up and do a search for this on the web, download this document, add this to your knowledge base, add this to all of your tools that you will need as an auditor for putting in a process for policies and procedures. Again, you don't need to understand the ins and outs of this document and this model, but you do want to be aware of it and what its purpose is. Now let me give you an example of a specific procedure. Let's say, for example, you have a firewall appliance at the perimeter of your organization. You're going to use this appliance to implement security, different types of security at the perimeter. And you may want to have a specific process in place for building in redundancy and failover. For example, you've got two identical devices, and if one fails, it fails over to the other device. Well, you need to have a process, a procedure in place, a step-by-step procedure for doing that. So here's a prime example where it says, complete the steps to configure failover with a serial cable. And it says step 1, attach the appliance network interface cables. Step 2, connect a serial failover cable between the primary device and the secondary device, and then configure the appliance, and then you have a step-by-step. This is a procedure. This is a specific subtopic of a policy. Individual steps for implementing a informational security policy. Now, we've already explored the concept of risk management earlier in the CISA series in the IS Audit Process movies, Part 1 and Part 2. But now I want to look at risk management a little bit further under the umbrella of information technology governance. Remember, risk management is the process of finding threats and vulnerabilities to information resources and determining which countermeasures or mitigation we can take to reduce the risk to an acceptable corporate level. Now, to have an effective risk management strategy, you have to have a really good understanding of the organization's appetite for risk. What's their risk tolerance level? And I've alluded to this already. It's this risk tolerance or this appetite for risk that really drives all of our management processes, all of our decisions in the context of information technology and information security, and how it's going to impact present and future outlays for technology, for applications, for personnel, and the list goes on. It's the extent to which IT assets are going to be protected. What types of assurance do we need? Now, we know that risk management itself is made up of identification, analysis, evaluation, treatment, monitoring, and then communication or documentation of the impact of risk. Remember, risk assessment, risk management, they go hand in hand. Now, as you can see in this diagram, this is really the 5 approaches to risk that the management board or the steering committee is going to take. Avoid, here at the top, this is, of course, avoiding risk altogether. If it's feasible, you'll just decide not to implement a certain program or a project or a process that's going to incur greater risk. You just avoid risk. For example, if you determine that having a wireless local area network policy is going to be too risky based on the geographic location of your organization or your buildings, then you know what? You may just avoid implementing a wireless solution. You may decide to mitigate against risk, putting out the outlays and the resources to define and implement controls to protect your IT infrastructure. You may want to transfer the risk. Transferring means sharing the risk with partners, possibly insurance companies, okay, or strategic partners to transfer the impact of risk. And then accept the risk. Accept the risk simply means to formally acknowledge in a documented fashion through a policy that the risk exists and that you're going to monitor it, but you're not really going to spend any money or resources to mitigate the risk. And then finally, eliminate the risk. When possible, do what you can to remove the source of the risk. Elimination, well, 100% elimination of risk is not achievable, okay? It's just not going to happen. So the things that are most practical are to transfer risk, reduce risk, accept risk, or avoid risk. Now, our overall risk management program, risk management and analysis program, has really two main goals. You need to establish the purpose of your program, and then once you determine the purpose, you're going to assign responsibilities for implementing this risk management plan to different departments, different individuals, different teams of people to develop and implement this risk management, risk analysis strategy. Now, there are several overall steps of the risk management process as it falls under the umbrella of IT governance. Let's take a look at those. Under the overall umbrella of IT governance, the risk management process really has 5 main steps. The first step is what we call identification and classification. This is also the taxonomy. It's another name for the word classification. Classifying information resources, classifying all of your assets that are vulnerable and need protection. You can be doing this to prioritize further investigation and further identification of the kind of protection mechanisms that you're going to need. For example, just simply classifying it based on the asset value, or you're looking at different systems and assets as based on how critical they are, how sensitive they are to vulnerability, things like that. Now, what assets are we talking about here? Talking about, well, personnel, people, the most valuable asset of your organization, documentation, data that's stored, data in transit, services, software, hardware, basic intellectual property, proprietary information, corporate secrets. Now, what you'll do next is you'll assess the threats and vulnerabilities. And you're looking for vulnerabilities that are associated with the information resources and how likely is it that a threat or an incident is going to occur. Remember, a threat is any circumstance or event that has the potential to do damage or harm to an information resource. And this can be caused by denial of service, modification of data, destruction of processes or data, disclosure to the wrong parties. It could also be errors. It can be malicious. It can be interior, exterior. It can be a structured attack, an unstructured attack. It could be fraud, theft, or just overall failure of hardware or software. Then you want to do an impact analysis. What is the impact of this threat or vulnerability? Are you going to lose money? Are you going to lose goodwill or your reputation to the public? Is this going to breach legislation or break laws? Is it going to cause physical endangerment to the staff, to customers? Is it going to lose opportunities for business? Is it going to increase the competitiveness by giving an inroad to a competitor? Are you going to reduce operational performance, lower efficiency levels, or cause an interruption to your business activity? That's an impact analysis. Then you'll kind of take all this information now, your taxonomy, your threat assessment, and your impact analysis, also known as a BIA, business impact analysis, and present an overall view of risk. This will be a documented report or summary of the overall view of risk to the management or to stakeholders. And then, of course, you're going to evaluate the existing controls, the existing mechanisms and mitigation techniques, and plan controls for the future once you've identified all of these areas. Those are the 5 main steps of risk management. And again, all of this under the auspices of IT governance. It's also important to realize that the whole process of IT risk management is going to function at 3 key levels. First of all, you've got the operational level. This is the level that is looking at risks that could compromise the efficiency, the effectiveness of your supporting network infrastructure, your physical infrastructure, your IT systems, servers, network devices, appliances, things like that. It looks at the abilities that there are to bypass system controls and to gain root level or admin access to these particular devices and appliances. The possible loss of key resources or the unavailability of key resources. Resources like personnel, physical premises, communication, systems, and data. It also, the operational level relates to the failure of compliance with legal action, with legal mandates, and government regulations. The project level is really looking at risk management and how it needs to focus on the project management, the ability to understand the scope of the initiative, to manage the project complexity, and looking at the risks, the consequences that this project, the objectives aren't met, and that the project is not delivered on time. And then finally, the strategic level. This is really where you look at the considerations of the overall governing IT capability and how it lines up, the linkage, the coupling with the overall organizational or business strategy. It'll compare the risk management that your company has to that of your competitors, and it'll also look at the threats and opportunities that are brought about by changes in technology or changes in governmental mandate. So 3 levels of IT risk management: operational, project, and strategic. And you may have steering committees or teams that are going to function at these different levels to implement a risk management, risk analysis strategy. Now, I mentioned risk analysis, so that's the last thing we're going to look at in this Nugget movie, and the 3 main methods that we're looking at here as far as information technology and how it relates to the CISA, the 3 risk analysis methods. Finally, as we look at risk analysis methods, realize this is an entire discipline on its own. The whole concept of qualitative analysis and research versus quantitative analysis and research is really these are really the 2 main approaches to research methodology as it applies to all of the social sciences. So it's not just simply this kind of microcosm of information technology, information security, and how, as an auditor of these different systems, this is a historical method that really covers all different types of, again, social services, social work, education, information systems, management systems, human services. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So I'm going to give you some basic fundamental definitions here. Qualitative analysis, in a nutshell, is a method that uses terminology, it uses words, it uses descriptive rankings to describe the likelihood or the impacts of different risks and vulnerabilities. This is the most frequently used method. It's also the simplest one to implement, okay? You would basically use checklists, okay? Establish best practices, guidelines, subjective risk ratings like high vulnerability, medium vulnerability, low vulnerability, or maybe criticality. High criticality, medium criticality, and low criticality. This is a really good approach for IT and IS. You generally won't see this, let's say, in accounting or in overall corporate management, but it's a really good method for us to use. Now, you've got quantitative analysis next. And of course, quantity should indicate to you numerical, or the opposite of subjective, a more objective approach. Quantitative analysis uses numerical values to describe the likelihood and the impact of risks. And you're going to use data from a whole number of different sources, from historic reports, just past operational reports, past experience. You'll look at general industry practices and guidelines, kind of look at numerically what happens across your industry and use that as a baseline. Statistical, theoretical analysis, testing, and experimentation. That's what we call the quantitative analysis method. And again, quantity, which has to do with numeric value or an amount, should give you what you need to know to be able to compare quantitative against qualitative. In a nutshell, quantitative is objective, qualitative is subjective. Then you've got kind of a semi-quantitative analysis, and this is basically just descriptive rankings that are associated with a numerical scale. So you come up with descriptive rankings on your own, based on checklists and subjective ratings, but then you're going to tie those to a numerical scale. And this is a really good approach when you just can't afford as an analyst or an auditor to implement a full-blown quantitative method, or you want to take out some of the subjectivity of the qualitative analysis method and introduce some objectivity into it. That's when you're going to introduce more of a numerical scale. So those are the three types of risk analysis methods. All you really need to know is just that kind of defining is the definitions themselves for the CISA exam. Don't worry about getting too much into the science of this. And that pretty much wraps up part 2 of IT governance. In this nugget, we explored 5 key knowledge areas: information technology policies, the IS policy document, procedures, the risk management process, and then finally, the 3 main risk analysis methods. I hope this CBT nugget's been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing. We'll see you in IT Governance Part 3.